Hey guys, it's Kazlo. We are back making another tier list. This time we are focusing on the dungeons introduced in Shadowbringers in Final Fantasy XIV. I thought with Endwalker just a little over 2 months away, it would probably be a good time to go through and talk about every dungeon that we encountered in Shadowbringers and where it kind of ranks. And I know that there's one on this that I'm probably going to rank pretty low that's going to upset a lot of people, but I'll at least make my case. Alright, coming up first is Holminster Switch. This is your first dungeon where you're taking on a Light Warden. And for story reasons, it gets a little bit of a bump, primarily due to its second boss. The first boss is the enemy that you see in the Shadowbringers trailer. It has some really unique mechanics, but once you get to that second boss, it just hits you in the gut. There you have to take on Tesleen in her Sin Eater form, just after hours before losing her to the Sin Eaters. And if you bring Trust with you, it makes it even more heart-wrenching because like Alice A has some unique lines. And that boss also has some really unique mechanics that I think are really good to teach new players. And then finally you get your last Light Warden. Your last boss is the first Light Warden boss that we have to fight. Which, again, is some really unique mechanics for a dungeon that really has to keep people on their toes. I think the real only hiccup in this dungeon is the pull between the second boss and the third boss, because it can be really drawn out when you're only fighting in a small little arena and just having to wait for mobs to spawn before you can burn them down. But other than that, I feel like this dungeon is about perfect, so I'm going to put it at A. It's just missing something to really push it to that S tier. Next up we have Dohn Mheg. This is one of the only dungeons in the base game where you're not taking on a Light Warden at the end. And it loses a little bit because of that. But I think where it really got hurt is because it was the dungeon that was given to content creators on the media tour. And so you see, especially the final boss, all the mechanics for it 100 times before the expansion ever released. But going boss by boss, boss 1 is just okay. There's nothing really special about it. You're fighting a was it Froth? I forget the name of that Fae, the Toad people, but you're fighting one of them, and it's just a standard boss. There's not really that many unique mechanics. The second boss, I think, is a little bit better because there's a mechanic where you have to tether yourself to some ads so that you get a buff to fight the boss, or else it grows too big and just one-shots you. And then the final boss, like I said, if I didn't know anything going in, I would have loved this boss. It requires you to walk a tightrope to be able to get over and fight him at one point. And it transforms at one point in the fight as well. It's a lot of fun as a boss fight if I hadn't seen it a ton of times before. Story-wise, there's not much. It's part of the 4 relics you've got to collect in Mheg to be able to get to the Light Warden. So there's not a lot of story significance to it. I'm actually going to probably drop this to a C. The Qitana Ravel. This one is kind of fun because your first pull, before you get to the first boss, you have these unique little mini bosses that you have to fight, where you're kind of in a hallway with things shooting at you from both sides, and you've got to kind of block those by standing in front of some stone walls while burning down those mini bosses. You've got a little pull in between them, and then you get to the first boss, which I actually really like because to see one of the mechanics, you actually have to look outside the arena to know which side of the arena is going to get hit with an AoE or not, as well as knowing what the boss is doing to avoid its AoEs at the same time, which is really unique. I like that. The second boss can be really rough if you can't tell where some pillars are falling. I've had groups wipe to that a lot because people just get smacked. And there's a really fun pull that you can do before that boss as well. That can be really scary for healers. I kind of love that part of it. And then finally, you've got a really cool pull with a whole bunch of Sin Eaters, and then the final boss, which is the Light Warden, that's very much like Cerberus, and some really unique mechanics there. Its big hiccup is that you're getting pushed back and forth across the arena, which can really slow down DPS, slow down kind of your enjoyment of that. I'm gonna give it a B. And I haven't talked about music. I will on some of these, but for these base Shadowbringers dungeons, they all kind of, you're mainly hearing the battle theme anyways, but so I didn't really get that much of a feel for music, except for Dohn Mheg. I remember Dohn Mheg having really good music. Next up, Malikah's Well. This one, except for the final boss, just feels like a standard dungeon. You just got regular ads for the most part, or regular mobs for the most part. The first boss is just like a little armadillo guy, and he's not fun. The mechanics are somewhat punishing, but also kind of easy to really get an idea of what you've got to do. There's only one part of that I think that ever really gave me a hiccup, and it's because I'd run too far out of an AoE and get hit with the next AoE. The second boss, who I'm going to call Buckethead, it's a big golem with a bucket on its head. There's a lot of downtime during that fight, a lot of just getting knocked around, and other than that, it's not really that interesting. But after you beat that and you're making your final pull, you start encountering Sin Eaters that are a lot more fun as a pull, and then you get to the final boss, which I really like the final boss because it teaches you what to do as you go along pretty well. It will have a move, and then it'll drop a whole bunch of pillars, and then each of those pillars in order will do the same move that it did, and then the boss will do the move again. It's really hard to explain, but like if there's a circle AoE that you got to stand under the boss for, you'll then have to go around the circle boss and then back under the boss. It can catch some people off guard if they don't understand what specifically is going on, but I think it telegraphs really well. But story-wise, there's not much other than the fact that you're going to kill Light Warden. That was the problem with Qitana Ravel as well, I didn't say. But I think between Qitana Ravel and Malikah's Well, I like Qitana Ravel more, so I'm going to drop it into C. Mount Gulg. This one I love a lot because of the story point of it. You are climbing up Mountain Gulg to stop Vothri. It's full of Sin Eaters, and then all of a sudden, as you're climbing up the mountain, you hit this like palace that looks like it's straight out of Nier Automata, just immaculately white. The first boss, right before you get to that point, is the lion with the crown Sin Eater. It's an okay boss. There's nothing that stands out about it in my head. I think a lot of it is just having to watch elemental stuff that's gonna, or environmental stuff that's going to create AoEs for you, and knowing how to deal with that. The second boss is what I'm going to call the light wall. You've got a wall with 9 masks on it, an arena cut into 9 squares, and those masks kind of tell you where you don't want to be standing as they'll light up at times. It's a lot of fun for people to kind of figure out what was going on the first time, but other than that, about normal. And then as you're getting to the final boss, you think you're probably going to fight Vothri, but instead out comes a angelic looking Sin Eater that has some really unique mechanics that sometimes I still don't really understand. And so Mount Gulg's getting in it. I love that dungeon. It has a problem being the level 79 dungeon, so you don't run it a lot for EXP. You're usually thrown into one of the other 4, but I love running through it. It's one of my favorite of the base dungeons, which, speaking of, we're coming to the level 80 dungeon, Amaurot, which is heavy on the story. You are reliving the final days of Amaurot, including fighting the first beast as the first boss, which is kind of like a caterpillar that wants to be a behemoth, is the easiest way for me to describe it, or a crawler more aptly. It's actually the big bad that you see in the Endwalker trailer that's being fought on the moon. But like I said, like behemoth, it's going to throw down meteors, and you've got to hide behind rocks. There's one point where a wall will fall down and you've got to avoid that. And it's a huge AoE. It's a fun boss. Then you get to the second boss, which isn't really a boss. I mean, you burn down, it's a big chicken. And you burn down part of it and it goes away. And then you just have to kill a whole bunch of ads. So it's kind of like another ad pull, or I guess technically a mob pull. And then it'll start self-destructing and you've got a DPS race to finish it off. And then this is where the dungeon just goes to another level. You take a teleporter and you are above the planet, watching as meteors just fall. And you've got these floating islands in the sky that you're running across, fighting demonic, weird beasts. And then you get to the final boss, which you don't realize it at the time. It's the boss that you've been seeing in the background of the entire dungeon, running around destroying stuff. And it's kind of like a demon wall, not in that it's like a wall that's alive coming at you, but in the fact that it's constantly moving towards you and you've got to kind of beat it before it pushes you back. Even though I don't think it ever actually does, I think it holds you at this very small area at the very end for however long it takes you to beat it. But it's got some safe spaces that then get destroyed. Overall, a ton of fun, and the whole atmosphere of heading up to the entire finale of Shadowbringers, the base Shadowbringers expansion. It's one of the S tiers. Just for that atmosphere, just for that final pull before the final boss, all of that. All right, now we move into what I'm going to call the Tombstone dungeons. These are all the dungeons in the patches, except for two of these are your Tombstone dungeons for immediately after you beat the expansion. The first one, Akadaemia Anyder. Hopefully I said that right. I'm not the biggest fan of this one. The first boss is probably one of my favorite bosses in all of the dungeons. It's the Shark Bros. You've got these two big anthropomorphic type sharks that you're fighting one at a time, and one of them will jump away, the other one will come up and fight you, and they each have unique mechanics and do that unique mechanic when they jump out of the water. So you've got to be watching the Shark Bro that's on the outside of the arena while you're fighting the other Shark Bro, and be prepared for whatever AoE or whatever move he's going to do. Love that. But then after that, the dungeon kind of goes downhill. You get to the second boss, which is just, I'm going to call it a Morble, but it's not really. It's just Morble-like. And it's not really all that interesting. There's a bunch of bad breath moves that you've got to avoid. But other than that, not too exciting. The mob pulls here aren't that exciting either. There's just flora and fauna from around Norvrant, and nothing too special about them. But where it gets really interesting is you get to the final boss, and it's Quetzalcoatl from Final Fantasy VIII. There's a bunch of lore implications as well with this dungeon, because it talks about, is it Elidibus? No, it's La Habrea, I think, this is kind of where he was doing his study in Amaurot and all of his experimentations before the summoning of Zodiark. The music here is also a lot of fun too. It's got a really jazzy feel to it because it's set in Amaurot, and that's kind of its go-to music for that place. But like I said, it's not really all that interesting outside of the first and third boss. So I'm gonna put it in C as well, just because I never get excited to get that dungeon that everybody gets excited for, though, both for lore reasons and music reasons, is the Twinning. And before anything, we're gonna cut to that music. It's great. It's great. On top of that, you've got this setting that's very much feels like foil mixed with Crystal Tower. I mean, you're literally in the Crystal Tower and you're going into the basement. The entire first bit up until the first boss feels like turn 3 of Coil of Bahamut, where you're jumping from arena, fighting all kinds of experimental monsters. And then you get to the first boss and it's like a Final Fantasy 13 behemoth, where he's like standing on hind legs, has a sword. And I really like that you can actually avoid a lot of stuff in the boss. He's got mechanics where if his moves hit these tubes that have monsters in it, those monsters will come out and attack you. So if you and your party are smart enough to avoid aiming those AoEs at those tubes, you'll never encounter any extra mobs and you can just burn through the boss really quickly. You've got a somewhat simple couple of pulls until the next boss, which visually isn't that interesting. I like the mechanics of this one because there's a lot of AoE on the ground and little spots where you can hide and then hope that people don't get targeted with an AoE and take it to each other. And then you've got a couple of simple pulls to get to the final boss, which is what I think throws the dungeon completely over the top. And that is, you are fighting a Magitech / Ironworks Alexander. And it's where in my head it finally hit me. That's how the Exarch was able to go back in time, is that Sid built an Alexander so that they could go back in time using the Crystal Tower to come to the first. That just realization blew my mind when I finally made the connection. But I think all of that, twinning has to be S tier, if only for the music alone. On to the patch dungeons. First off, we've got the Grand Cosmos. This is where you are fighting through a mansion so you can get to a character that you need to be able to do some research regarding stopping the process by which people turn into Sin Eaters. Also ends up being really useful for understanding tempering. This NPC also becomes really important for the entirety of the Norvrant patches, which are 1, 2, and 3, or 5.1, 2, and 3, as he's helping you create a way for everybody to get back to the source. So that story beat is kind of nice. The problem is that the dungeon, outside of a few things, isn't all that special. God, I can't even remember what the first pull is. I think the first pull, you're entering the mansion and fighting mobs through it, which they're mobs coming out of paintings, if I remember correctly. Kind of interesting. You get to the first boss. It's got an interesting mechanic where it will drop ink or some sort of substance on the floor and then summon brooms from each side to come over, and you've got to avoid being hit by the brooms. When the brooms hit that stuff, they spin around to clean it up, which makes a big AoE that you've got to avoid. Other than that, that's the only real unique mechanic I remember from that boss. You then enter the courtyard with some really simple, not that interesting pulls. Fight a boss that's not that interesting. Again, it's a plant type creature that sometimes will make parts of the floor actually grow grass and stuff, and you've got to keep these seeds from being in that grass or else they'll sprout ads that you've got to fight. That's not all that interesting. You do another pull through the mansion and you get to the final boss, which is the easiest way to say it is it's the real like living liquid, where it's on fire, humanoid form. And its big mechanic is that it will set you on fire and you've got to go burn something with yourself to be able to get that debuff off of you. So you're like running to a couch, running to a piano to set it on fire. I remember I died on this boss the time I cleared it. Me and the healer, and I think a DPS and a tank finished it off. So it's not all that difficult of a dungeon. I want to put another one in C, but I'm going to have to because, like I said, it's not all that interesting. This next one's the one that's gonna probably upset some people. It's Anamnemis Anyder. In my mind, the only good thing about this dungeon is the first pull. You're riding on the back of Bismarck as he's flying through the ocean, and you're encountering all these mobs, most of them from sea in Final Fantasy XI, if you know those mobs. They also showed up in Eureka. That entire thing where you can see him swimming through the ocean, breaking through rock walls, all that stuff going on while you're fighting enemies. That part is great. It's when you get off Bismarck that this dungeon falls apart for me. The first boss, which is called Unknown, and it's kind of like a T-Rex without a face, is one of the worst dungeon bosses in the game. Sometimes you can get really unlucky with the RNG on his moves to where people just can't avoid stuff and you die. I mean, technically there's probably a way to look out, but I've never I don't want to say never. There's more than a 50% chance you're going to wipe on it the first time, is the way it feels. And then the second pull, getting to the second boss isn't that interesting. The second boss is a Cyclops type creature, but it's not like the ones that we have on the source. It more has 2 horns and 1 eye, and it's got a couple unique mechanics. It's got a couple that are hard to really telegraph what's going to go on. I know that there's a way to look at it. I think part of it is I didn't play hardcore during the time that this dungeon came out, and so I didn't run it a ton of times in the duty finder or in roulettes. But I still got to talk about the final boss. Yeah, your last bit, you're fighting Chahagans all the way up until you get to near the end, and that's where you encounter mobs that are summoning stuff from crystals that the pull's just not interesting. I mean, you could burn down those guys and avoid some of the mobs that you gotta fight, but ultimately you just pull it all and burn down the best you can. And then the final boss is a big female Shahagan. Not that interesting to fight. The mechanics are, I feel like for normal players it's a little bit hard to understand. I didn't have a problem grasping it, but every group I've had in this has issues with this boss. I don't enjoy this dungeon, and it is a D for me. It is the one that I would hate to get anytime. But we come back to another good dungeon after this. We have the Heroes Gauntlet, which has heavy story significance as you are making your trip across Norvrant to get to the Crystal Tower and stop Elidibus. You start off on an airship coming from Yulmore and crash down in Amaurot. And as you're fighting through this dungeon, as you're going through Amaurot, you encounter all the NPCs that you encountered in your time through the story. You're fighting these heroes, these warriors of light from other shards that have gotten summoned, and fighting them all along the way. The first boss is a thief job, which is really unique. It's got a mechanic where it will put down 2 markers, and whatever the move it's telegraphing is, it will do that move at those 2 markers. So you've got to go, okay, he's got a big circle AoE coming out, he's going to the corners, I need to be in one of the other corners. He's got a big line AoE, I need to make sure I'm not in the line of those daggers that he put down. After that, you move on and you're in Dohn Mheg, and you're encountering all the NPCs you saw there, and you get to the boss and you're fighting a necromancer who will summon these corpses that will chase you or crawl to you, and you've got to make sure that you're not standing near somebody else so that when they die and blow up on you, you're not hitting 2 people. The final the final stretch before the final boss is really cool because there's a chance that one of the summoned NPCs on the side will be Hildebrand, wondering what happened to him, why he's here. So that's a lot of fun. And then you get to, and this is Lakeland that you're fighting through now, and you get to the final boss, which is a berserker who has a really cool mechanic where he does a huge move that you got to avoid, and the way you avoid it is you go into these divots that he's made into the arena, but you can't stand in the arena in those divots for too long or else you get a debuff that will basically confuse you, and so you've got to time going in at just the right time. This is another S tier for me. Just the atmosphere, the storyline that's going on at the time. I don't want to say too much. I think I've said too much already. It puts it up there as one of the great dungeons of Shadowbringers. Matoya's Relict. This one is odd because the story for this dungeon is you're basically collecting items from Matoya's workshop so that she can make a mother pork seed. And so after you've got 3 wings that you've got to go to get items. And after you complete that wing, it takes you back to the start of the dungeon for you to do the next wing. The first part, you get to the boss and it is a mudman, is the easiest way to describe it. There are 4 holes in the corners of the arena. He'll summon boulders on occasion. You've got to it'll be tethered to everybody. You've got to aim them at the holes. Sometimes there'll be a monster in the hole, and so you can't send something that way or it will knock it back. It's an okay boss fight, not anything interesting. The next one is the water segment. Here you're climbing down, and the boss that you get to, I forget the name of it, but it's like a little water droplet. It's super cute. The mechanics here are pretty interesting because the boss will tether to a side and make these water tubes shoot out water, and you've got to watch and see which one is the safe spot to stand in. Another time it summons ads that you've got to kill to get to the next phase. They are up on this cloud. You've got to get a water spout to shoot you up the top of the cloud, and then you can burn those down, wait for the boss to do its big move, go down and kill it. I think the best part of this dungeon is after this boss though. The next wing, you are in this area that has all this what looks like kind of lava running through, but it's rainbow colored. I think the lore explanation is this is like melted down ether, and so each of the colors is like a different element of ether in lava form. You go to the end of this wing, there's not a boss here. You come back and you fight the mother Porksy that has been created so you can tame it and actually use it. This fight is actually kind of a lot of fun. It's got a couple of moves where you've got to plan for it to snort you backwards so that you're standing in the safe space. It's got another part where it's sucking everybody in and you've got to like run away, sometimes literally use your flee ability to get ahead, because if it sucks you all the way in, it kills you. Overall, a pretty fun fight. I think if it had more of a like interesting story significance other than just collecting items to make a Porksy, it'd be a little bit better. I don't think it's as good as Gulg and Holminster. I'll put it on B with Qitana Ravel. It could very well be A though. It's in that space between B and A. Alright, finally, the last one that is going to be hard for me to pronounce, but that's Paglth'an. This is an area where the Amaurot are from, just outside Thanaland. And the entire purpose of this dungeon is you are trying to fight back the forces of Lunar Bahamut. It's kind of protecting a tower, and you've got some people trying to infiltrate that tower, and you're also trying to help the Amaurot that are being attacked at the same time. The pulls here, the first pulls aren't that interesting. The first boss isn't totally interesting either. It's a big coral. You'll sometimes get targeted with a lightning strike and you've got to take it to a tower. That was already done, I think, better in the Aerie back in Heaven's Ward. I think it's the second pull you start to see Estinian and Tiamat helping out in the background fighting enemies, and then you fight this big, for the second boss, this big Magitech contraption. Basically just ends up being that you burn down a whole bunch of ads that are coming out and fight you, and then you take, I don't want to call it what to call it, but it's a bouncer. It puts you up to the core of this wall. You take half its health off, it kicks you back out, you kill ads again, jump up, finish killing it, and half the thing will blow away and you can move on. As far as the boss go, it's not that interesting. I think Amaurot did better with the chicken as a what I call an ad rush boss. The final pull, you get to interact with Tiamat along the way. She'll be burning down ads. You can see her AoE on the ground, and you can move ads into it for them to take a whole bunch of damage. And then you finally face off against Lunar Bahamut, who overall isn't that difficult. Just gotta watch the AoEs, make sure to move into the right spots. I honestly was let down that that's how Lunar Bahamut went out, but this one, I kind of want to put it in C as well. It's just not all that interesting to me. Yeah, I'm gonna do it. It's gonna be a C as well. It's kind of sucks because that's the last dungeon we get before Endwalker, and it kind of went out on a low note. But there is a really cool duty that you have to do, solo duty after this, as a part of 5.55. That's a lot of fun. But as far as like a dungeon goes, this was just average. So I honestly, C is probably best for that. But that is my tier list for the Shadowbringers dungeons. Let me know how terrible I did in the comments below, how much you love Anamnemis Anyder. I know people love that dungeon. Like I said, I absolutely hate it. It was just my experience with it. But I should have more videos like this out every month on the first Saturday of each month. So be sure, if you like this video, to go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you can check out those videos when they come out. Otherwise, I sometimes stream over on Twitch, so give me a follow there. There's a link in the description below, so you can come chat with me. There's also links to my social media and a link to my Discord channel if you want to be part of that daily community. But that said, I'm going to start prepping some more for Endwalker. See you guys later. Take care.